All right, welcome to a new episode of Growing Down. Today we have a special episode. Jeremy Johnson is not available, so we have invited two of our previous guests, Stephanie Lepp from Infinite Lunchbox and Reckonings, and Brent Cooper of the Abstract Org. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so our format today is just to go around sort of a roundtable style and just discuss sort of current events, also theoretical backgrounds into maybe our beliefs, etc. Today, I think we're going to start off with the integral left point of view on public safety. Stephanie, what are your thoughts on that subject?
Okay, so I'm going to try something out. I have not even really talked about this yet, but we're going to try it out and see how it works. So, yeah, so right now, this question is coming up, or just, it's like calls are coming up to defund the police. But then, the question is obviously, well, what would replace it? And there's an idea to shift funds from police to social services, which makes sense. And I would like to introduce a framework that we might use for thinking about like what might be an integral approach to public safety. So I might just share my screen to like show you guys something. But before I get there, so a couple of years ago, this is just context for what I'm going to show you. A couple of years ago, emotional intelligence expert Daniel Goleman did this. Well, he interviewed. So there's all these ideas about what makes an effective leader, as if there's like one way to be an effective leader. So a couple of years ago, Daniel Goleman interviewed hundreds of business leaders and found that there are 6 types of effective leadership. I'm just going to show you and made this matrix. Okay. Oh, can I share my screen?
Yeah, that was I'm not 100% sure with the Zoom and maybe in the host exactly how to go about doing that.
If not, I can just explain.
Yeah, how about we just explain it and then.
Okay, so basically what he did is he identified 6 different types of leadership. So let's say it's like commanding, visionary, affiliative, different types of leadership. Each type of leadership he identified works better in different circumstances. So let's say commanding is really helpful when you're in the middle of a crisis and you need to just like get everyone on board with the plan and get out of the crisis. Visionary is really helpful when you need to make an enormous change and you need to mobilize people around some new shared vision. Affiliative is really helpful when there have been rifts on the team and you need to kind of like heal up those rifts in order to move forward. But it's not just that different styles work better in different circumstances. He also identified different styles have a different like impact on the overall organizational climate. So commanding has an overall negative impact because it's not really that fun to be commanded. Visionary has the most strongly positive impact because it feels really good, right, to mobilize around a new shared vision. Affiliative has a positive impact, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, it's both descriptive, like certain styles do work better in certain circumstances, and it's also normative. Like we actually like some styles better than others because they're more humane or they just feel good for people. So if we are to use a style that's more negative, we basically use it in order to get us out of the situation we're in where we need it and to get us into a new situation where we don't actually need to use it anymore and we can shift into a leadership style that we like better. Anyway, that is all just a preamble so if we were to take that as a template, like, and I don't think Daniel Goleman like is familiar with integral theory per se, and I don't think he like thought that this is what he was doing, but what I take from this leadership matrix is he's basically kind of making a template for integral strategy, for a template for like putting different ways of achieving the same goal, like understanding the circumstances under which each of them is effective, and also understanding that like we actually like some of them better than others, right? We only want to use some when we have to, and we'd actually rather use other ones that are, we could say are like more humane or more just. And so if we're thinking about public safety, in that kind of a context, I'm just going to ask you to visualize a matrix like this, where we have like traditional policing, community, like all of the strategies for public safety, traditional policing, community policing, social services, next door, like those apps where neighbors get to know each other and like work out their problems together. With all different strategies we have, we could identify the problems that they are like each uniquely capable of solving or dealing with, and there will certainly be some overlaps. And then we can also kind of, take a look at, or put, I don't know if, I think probably like impact on the neighborhood or municipality is probably too broad, but we can think about criteria like propensity for, risk of violence, or whatever criteria we want to kind of like evaluate these different public safety strategies according to. What kind of emerges is, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say it is kind of like an integral policy or an integral approach or integral way of thinking about public safety. It's a framework for understanding under what circumstances might we engage which combination of public safety strategies, and therefore, of course, who should get funding, right? Because what are actually the problems that we're having and who is most uniquely capable of dealing with them. And like this leadership matrix, it's not just descriptive, right? It's not just like which thing works better in which circumstance. It's also normative. It's not just about using what works, but about moving us in a particular direction that, that like of, let's say, like less traditional, or less of the strategies that are whatever, like less of the strategies that are more prone to violence or risk resulting in a fatality than others. And I don't have like a list of criteria obviously worked out together. So I'm just going to conclude by saying, instead of having a debate about which, public safety strategy is best, we can just imagine like proponents or representatives of each different strategy, kind of, traditional policing, social services, etc., filling out some kind of a matrix like this together and defining the circumstances under which their strategy works well, what its social impact is, etc. And if there's no circumstance under which your strategy is not the best, then you're probably not, i.e. if your strategy works the best under every single circumstance, you're probably not really the right representative to participate in this activity. But anyway, so the matrix basically becomes a tool for integral public safety policy making. Does that make sense? And what do you think?
Well, I think, at least when I'm hearing that, I think, number one, there's obviously the tagline right now is defund the police, but I think there's a lot of different angles as far as what that might mean. I know I posted something yesterday in Discord about Colorado passing a police reform bill, but I think one of the things you said, Stephanie, that I would also add, I think it is important to look at using the descriptive part is where is the evidence that says one is better than the other? Because I think that should go a long way into selecting what works and what doesn't. Just to go real quick on some of the items that were in the police reform bill, just to give an idea of maybe public policy things that are being discussed. All local and state police officers must wear body cameras by 2023. Body camera footage must be made public. Chokeholds are prohibited. Shooting at fleeing suspects is prohibited. Deadly force can be used if a person's life is in imminent danger. Police must report every instance in which they stop someone who they suspect of a crime. They must also include that person's race, gender, and ethnicity. Police must report other officers for wrongdoing. Officers can be held personally liable for damages up to $25,000 if they are found guilty of violating an individual's civil rights. I know when I read that, I was like, all of those seem to make a lot of sense, and kind of surprised we're not in a day and age maybe where that's already happening. But I know, looking at the different bills that have passed, or at least trying to pass, I know the Senate has one version, the Republican version of what they want to see police reform looks like. The House Democrats have another one. So I definitely think there's the debates happening, which I think is the most important thing. And I think obviously the protests have fueled this conversation, which I think has been highly valuable, no matter kind of which side you're really coming at it from. Ryan and Brent, you guys got a take on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, throw this out there, and this can kind of tie into Brent's project on consensus building. But my question to Stephanie is, I like the idea of the matrix. And I think it's a really helpful framework to try to understand which policy or tactic to implement at a certain time. My question is, what is the process of developing consensus or agreement upon which one is supposed to be used, right? And that's kind of a problem with integral, is whenever there's a lot of options, no one can agree on which one is the best for a certain circumstance. So how do we go about deciding that?
Yeah, and that is something I would actually love to hear Brent talk about. But before I maybe try to answer that and hand it over to Brent for a sec, the in response to you, Matt, too, like that all is great, like how to reform policing, and that's still within the context of thinking of policing as like the strategy for achieving public safety. And there's a little zooming out that needs to happen and say, whoa, 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 the goal isn't like how to make policing better. I mean, that is a goal, absolutely. But the bigger picture goal is, how do we create public safety in our communities? And so to zoom out and say, you know, and right now, maybe like, I don't actually know how it works in different municipalities, but let's say there's like a pot of money for public safety and it's all going to the police departments. I don't actually know if that's true, but if that's the case, then there's this question of like, whoa, 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 there's actually all these other ways that public safety is achieved that does not include the police. So how do we actually zoom out and say, okay, the bigger picture goal is public safety. What are the different strategies for achieving that goal? Under which circumstances are those strategies most effective? Which ones would we rather use because they're more just and humane and affordable and et cetera, all the criteria we care about? And therefore, right, how should we allocate the money? But as far as like how to get, you know, it's like me being idealistic, I'm like envisioning some kind of like anti-debate where proponent or like representatives of the different strategies show up and like fill out this matrix to get like really work it out. But this is also, I mean, you know, like no one wants to lose their funding, right? So, and we know who's going to be losing the funding. So, you know, how to actually like facilitate that in a way that like keeps everyone aligned on the goal and not on their piece of the pie. Yeah, I'm just gonna hand it over to Brent right now.
Okay,
Let you speak to that.
I'm totally gonna bust your chops now, but I'll try to be constructive and gentle. So the matrix that you're sharing, I'm looking at it now, and you know it's useful and helpful to talk about. But my first impression was like, okay, this is from a business context. Like, why are we even bringing it up and applying it to this issue of public safety and public policy? Because there's a big gap from the business context to the public. And then this is also about leadership, not about policy.
I would say that's irrelevant. You can like erase the contents of this matrix because it's really just the template.
Sure,
it's like
sure.
Different strategies, circumstances, you know, criteria. Yeah.
It can be, it can give us some help though too in understanding the police leadership styles, because immediately, you know, I'm going to assume that commanding is the typical sort of leadership function in police. It's very hierarchical. It's about authority. It's about enforcing the law, whatever the law says, even if the law is wrong, right? So it's the opposite of coaching and democracy and all these types of things.
Yeah, I just want to cut, like, I wouldn't take too seriously.
Sure.
It's just the template, but it's like
yeah.
Business leadership is like irrelevant to this conversation.
Yeah. But I was gonna draw a parallel to my consensus article, because I also draw from a source that's from a business context. And so, you know, it can be informative, but we need to like transfer it. And so in that sense, it was about, you know, how does the CEO or manager build consensus on a team, right? And there's 5 separate strategies that can be employed, and they kind of come sequentially. But it ends up being a kind of inclusive democratic process, because those types of consensuses are more robust, they last longer. So that's what we would want in policing too. You know, you want them to actually accept it. And so I think there's a huge gap with policing. Like with police reform, they need to educate police officers, right? So, you know, we want to I want to defund it, but when we pivot to that slogan, it's a matter of unpacking what it means. Because, you know, movements will use these catchphrases because they're useful and they hold some nugget of truth. But of course, it can be misleading too. So, but, you know, in the positive sense, like police departments are overfunded. Like they have all this capital to spend on weapons and training, and it just becomes more and more militarized. Because that's effectively what they're trained to do. It's very limited and it's very compartmentalized from other sorts of social concerns, right?
And
So
it's not even totally tailored to the problems that we have.
Yeah, not at all. So yeah, so leadership in the business context, that's where a lot of these sort of, you know, templates and kind of, you know, heuristics and stuff come from. But we need to be careful from it, because everything that's happening should be informed by the research, by the public policy, and by the movement itself, because all of that content precedes the messaging, right? So all of the movement and research preceded Black Lives Matter, and then that precedes defund the police, right? So you know, the writing's been on the wall for a long time, but we need to reverse these trends. And in terms of leadership, you know, I think all of these leadership styles can be useful. Like, you know, for commanding, it just depends if the person is kind of a fascist or, like, you know, actually an egalitarian. Like,
I think it also really depends if they know how to devolve power once you've gotten that. I mean, exactly. Like, once you're done using this thing that you needed to use, are you able to say, all right, we're moving away from commanding now because we don't need it anymore, even if it's the one I'm the best at, or I really like being in power, or whatever. Yeah.
I also think there's 2 different things going on here. Kind of what Brent's saying is, I think that while you can apply that matrix, I think I've also seen it in some variety, like with parenting, it's more like an interpersonal relationships. When you're looking at the police, I think you're looking at a more of a systematic sort of, okay, a little bit more complex as far as what's actually going on here, to how did we get to this place, and sort of, is this over the top? You know, like, do we need to look at this more closely? I also think there's a lot of sort of, if you look at why the police have so much funding, you know, I think that's a whole nother debate onto itself.
Totally. Yeah.
So there's definitely there's a systematic issue, I think, that it's worth looking into. And, you know, I think another sort of label attached to defund the police is systematic racism, that I've heard a lot with the George Floyd incident. I think that's supposed to just increase public awareness to this issue. And what I like about it is you have people, again, talking about it at the water cooler about, hey, what do you think about this issue? Is there systematic racism? What is systematic racism? And it's definitely an interesting, you know, we've talked about sort of the movement, social justice. I think this has been something that has ignited, definitely in America and actually international. I mean, you see protests all over the world right now that has to do with this issue. So it's definitely a relevant issue. Yeah.
Yeah. And Matt, I would like, yes, to your point, this is absolutely just an exercise in thinking about like an integral approach to public safety, but does not whatsoever like, or does not necessarily speak to like how to actually, you know, I guess kind of back to Ryan's question, like how to actually convince people, or like, or you know, or however, like to the extent that if we're fighting to defund the police, like it would serve us to have this like, you know, articulated alternative, then, it can be a part of that. But I guess, Ryan, I would kind of throw your question back to you a little too. Like, do you think that, I don't know what, like, yeah, do you think it would be possible? Do you think, and I guess this is such an abstract, it's like, what would be possible? Like getting the chief of police and the head of social service, whatever, all into a room together to try to like hash this out. But I don't know. Yeah. Do you have a perspective on kind of like how to make that happen? how to make the people who, let's say, like drive different public safety strategies in a given municipality to come together and try to come up with like an integral approach to public safety in their municipality?
Yeah, well, the honest answer is I have no idea if that's how successful that would be. I mean, I do have friends who are facilitators who do this kind of work with like public officials and, the field of like collaborative governance and so forth, where they have these kind of meetings and facilitated meetings where people can, different stakeholders and different interest groups can come together and work out a solution. But I think there are kind of two parts of this, the usefulness of the matrix. So I think what you're getting at, Stephanie, is the role of even just thinking about problems in this sort of way, where we are so used to policing, we've kind of forgotten about the underlying function or reason why we have police, which is the larger issue of public safety. And what this matrix illuminates is that there are multiple routes to get to that same goal of achieving public safety, and it doesn't all have to be this forceful militarized police, which is a very specific culture, a very specific hammer in which everything looks like a nail, which is obviously problematic for solving issues that may require softer skills or other kinds of social services, or having social workers come with you or psychologists to de-escalate conflict or whatever. Then there's the actual interpersonal messy part of working with human beings with conflicting interests and values and so forth to get them to agree on how this is going to be done, right? And I think that would be amazing if different sectors and different institutions, all with their own little myopic interests, can start communicating with each other and start to actually have some communication between these different systems that have been compartmentalized and very much rigidified into their own little siloed bubbles. So how that would be done, I mean, if you got me into the room, I would try. I don't know how to make that meeting happen, but I think that it's definitely, I think with Brent's, the consensus method that you've researched, I think could be a very nice step-by-step process that people can follow to try to achieve consensus. And then when you frame it as an issue of public safety, you can get really creative in terms of how to achieve that goal, to think outside the box of like police, guns,
Right.
force.
And then you also get the right like metrics that you're looking for.
Yeah. And it goes back to what I was saying about like most of the research already exists for this stuff. There's so much redundant research, and what jumps off the page to me with these leadership styles is the ones that have an overall positive impact. And also if you read what, like the modus operandi is and how it works, like people come first, right? Like the affiliative pace setting and coaching seem to be the ones I think the police should be embracing and employing, which they're not traditionally. And then the role for the commanding and stuff and visionary and democratic has to come from the movements and the research that's informing these things, right? And that means the people, like I think as we all agree to some extent, the people that are currently running the country and running the discourse, right? Let's say like the Republicans and then the establishment Democrats, they're doing a horrible job at all of these types of leadership, right? But we do need leadership. Yeah,
not even a style.
We do need the commanding type, which is do what I tell you, and it demands immediate compliance. But we need that obviously coming from the right people, the people that know about this stuff. And so for me, that's always what these social movements are about. Let's listen to different conversations, and let's hear the right people. Let's change the discourse. So we're starting to see that, and Matt listed off some good sort of policy prescriptions, but of course it has to go so much further than that. Like we have to reform pretty much every sector to vet out corruption and incompetence and the violence that these hierarchies and these weaponized systems of control do.
Yeah, and so Brent, I think, again, you've written a couple good articles lately that I wanted to kind of bring up, maybe specifically the Convergence for consensus building. And how I read your article was really about this. I think you actually offered sort of an olive branch as far as to these different sense-making communities about calling people out, rightfully so, not in a sort of harmful way, but calling. And I think that's kind of where I see at least our community trying to do, is trying to take these big ideas and trying to collect them all into one place and trying to differentiate as far as and deliberate as far as what's good, what's bad, what's the baby, what's the bathwater, what's this group do well, what's that group does poorly, and we're trying to mix it all in, because I think one of the, at least my perspective is with these intelligentsia, the community, we're trying to come up with some of the background into what informs some of these decisions that eventually trickles down into some of these policy makers. And so Brent, I don't know, like if you want to kind of riff on it a little bit as far as that article, what drove it for you, and how it sort of maybe plays into this question of how does it eventually trickle down into policymaking.
Yeah, I appreciate riffing on it, and getting your guys' feedback, whoever's read it here. I did spend 2 hours this morning unpacking a lot of it with Layman Pascal. So, we'll try not to retread some of that territory, but I'll try to bring up some of the same baselines and talking points, and we'll explore it from there. I mean, right at the kind of in my introduction, right at the top, in terms of what motivated me to do this is kind of a long-term interest in these things, right? Like peace studies and conflict resolution through my background in international relations. But more specifically, I have here, against my idealism, I often hear the phrase, "Oh, you'll never get everyone to agree." And so many people have said that to me in different contexts. And I always reply like, "Well, have you tried?" And the answer is no. Like, people are trying different things. They're not trying to build consensus. They're trying to sense make together. They're trying to have conversations. They're trying to work together. But consensus is a whole other thing, and it's a process, and it involves all sorts of prefigurative work and homework and mediation and facilitation. So I'd like to try it. And, the interesting thing is, like, the pretext for these kinds of things is when there's uncertainty and low levels of trust, right? It's precisely when we need these kinds of practices. And a lot of my work is, kind of meta-analysis. I'm aggregating lots of sources. So I'm trying to synthesize a consensus from, an array of fields, or like an array of authors on a given topic. So, and I was attracted to this, all these articles in this particular process, the 8 breadths of process architecture, because it's something that's like, it's very integral in the sense that, there's a template we can follow. And the outcome is not necessarily predetermined, but we will be drawn forward by certain attractors. And the more you understand this process, the more you understand how incentivized it is, right? So people's first impressions are to be turned off and to say, "Oh, that's not going to work," or "I don't want to change my mind." But, we're also trying to get to a point of action too, right? So for things like climate change, it's not even sufficient to agree that it exists, but that we need to have a consensus on a certain type of concerted action. And for the process to work, it requires, all of the resources and materials and participation and will that we can muster. And so, as I said to Layman, and I've said to other people recently, the process starts small. It can start on a one-to-one basis, and it can start in a group like this, and grow out into a more formal procedure. But we've got a roadmap, so it's a starting point. I want to hear what you guys think, and we can just keep riffing.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead, Ryan.
I was just going to ask Brent, so you had mentioned starting kind of small and one-on-one, but I'm wondering how do you visualize this project scaling up to the level that we need it to scale to? Like, are we talking like, let's start with like 4 people in a Zoom call, or should we make a Facebook group on consensus building of the emergency, or what is your idea of what this looks like?
I don't know exactly how it's going to roll out in that sense. I think one-to-one is good at the beginning because I'm trying to, you know, build trust and support, and you know, just spinning it off into Facebook groups, as we've already done with certain things, isn't necessarily sufficient. I think we have to fast track it a bit too, because I do think there's a time constraint. There's various time constraints. So, you know, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I'm going to keep pushing it and doing it with different people and practicing it myself, you know. And the good news is, I think the more you do it, you kind of get ahead of the curve. And it doesn't build up arrogance, but it builds up confidence and humility, because this is a really complex process. And there's a particular image which you guys will appreciate, especially. It keeps popping into my head, because Ryan, your question is about kind of like, well, what is the vision? How do I see this ending? And I keep thinking of Dr. Strange, because he sees into the future, right? But then he can't tell Tony Stark what happens. He says to Tony Stark, if I tell you, it won't happen. So there's a bit of a paradox here, because I do think I know what people should do sometimes and what should happen. But the paradox is, well, do I tell them what I think? Or will that have a backfiring effect, right? Do I instead try to create the conditions? And of course, I don't fully know what should happen. But, you know, for the purposes of this example, you know, I'm pretending that I'm Dr. Strange and I've seen the future and I know how this all ends. But I can't tell Tony Stark, and I can't tell the audience. And there's a reason for that. Right.
Well, let me pause you there, Brent,
Okay,
because I think you're
sure.
at a good spot. So I kind of
Okay.
wanted to go down to that, the steward and the sensei part of the stewarding, grandmothering practice, and the grandfathering, because really what I see there is that space of potentiality. And to me, the present is the actuality, and we already kind of know what's going on. And I think what's really interesting about, at least where I come from with my integral background, is how do you navigate the uncertainty realm? And I think you're exactly right. And just kind of looking at this architecture thing you did, I kind of think we're already in the middle of this. I mean, I see a lot of this happening on different formats. I mean, everyone's coming from different backgrounds for whatever reason, but all of a sudden right now, we're all converged in the sense of these different groups are talking to each other. And at least in my experience so far, there's no universal language yet to say, hey, we're in agreement. Like, how many times have you guys heard this? Like, it always seems like we're kicking the can around of sense making, and no one says, well, this kind of makes sense to me. I mean, there's not too much, and so I definitely like that piece, because I definitely get, there's that yin yang spiritual element to it. And I think to make sense of the world, at least where I'm coming from, you have your feet in sort of the both the right side and the left side. You know, you have the that ability to sort of be able to navigate these two different areas. And I think the real skill needs to come from the sense makers, is how do you keep balance, right? How do you stay on that surfboard and be able to navigate this stuff? You may know how to do it, but you never know when a wave's going to come up and knock you off your board, so to speak. So I guess I'm really interested in, what do you think about that, the steward and the sensei sort of yin yang symbol? I was really drawn to that. Brent.
Yeah. Let me first, I wanted to just quickly kind of expand on this point of sense makers, because I came across this Paradexity article too, and I thought it was interesting because it employs this term sense makers, right? Of course, in a kind of more generic sense, but this is the term that, the Stoa folks and the Rebel Wisdom folks kind of brand themselves with. And, it comes back to the kind of reckoning and the critique kind of stuff, because I say it should be better. But it's interesting, the definition here is like, the sense makers are who help us find patterns and meaning in our experience will be highly influential and sought after. And that is what they're effectively striving for, right? And then the core areas of development, the ability to translate knowledge into wisdom, right? Again, that's kind of what they're trying to do, but they don't have a consensus, right? And they're kind of thriving on the uncertainty too. You know, a lot of them speak, and, you know, Peter Lindbergh, like, identifies as a performative agnostic for this reason. So, and I said to Layman this morning, like, we can build consensus around certain things, but we can also build it around uncertain things, right? So it can be kind of open-ended. So I just wanted to put all that out there because I like this table that I put together from that article, because it's a, you know, 3x4 thing, and it's got the like the 4 levels, but they feed into the 1, 2, 3 kind of process across, right? So I thought that was really useful. But to go back to the stewarding and sense making thing, senseiing, yeah, I think a lot of people who, you know, are trained as facilitators might automatically be drawn to one role or the other, right? And it's great in a sense that it's kind of gendered, even though, you know, we don't want it to be sexist. But it's like, you know, there's a kind of, you know, myth and symbolism behind that, right? And it gives us 2, like you said, yin yang. I like that. Like, it says 2 categories. So I haven't thought that deeply about it beyond that, because actually the only resource I really drew from for this was that 3-page PDF, right? So I don't know if there's a longer exposition somewhere, you know, where we could explore these concepts. But I just figured, you know, as part of the like I agree with what you said, that we're kind of in the middle of it, you know, and different people can be at different places. But in terms of resetting the process for different cohorts, the call, the first step, the call and the clarify, the next step where you build the core team, kind of invites people to come and assign themselves these types of roles, you know, and for us to have a kind of, you know, not a consensus building session right from the start, but just an open kind of divergent process, like holding space, right? So the space is held by the stewards, I suppose. And then the convergence is kind of the invitation to practice through the senseis. So so there's a linear path there, but I think as this PDF itself suggests, and the other research suggests, is that it's linear, but it's also circular, right? So when you finish, you start again. So it becomes iterative, and so so I'll stop there because we just keep getting more meta after that, but that's a good place to stop.
Yeah, definitely. I want to make this all participatory, and I want to ask Stephanie if you got any thoughts on so far where we're at.
Yeah.
There you go.
First, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the first reaction is thank you, Brent, for keeping your eye on the bigger picture. I mean, it just takes, you know, it takes a special person to not just be focused on like their ism or whatever they're pushing, and like, yeah, just focus on the field and like how to evolve the field, and therefore how to build consensus between these different kind of worlds within it. I guess just, yeah, one question that, well, 2 things. One question that comes up is, have you seen this kind of consensus building in other fields, and like what has worked well? I mean, are there analogs for this? And then the second, I mean, yeah, just, you know, I've been for the last 4 years, you know, talking to people who've made all kinds of transformative change. And one thing I can tell you is people don't change by being told to change. So, I mean, there's also just the question of like, what did you think, or do you think would come out of writing the piece in this way? Or like, if what you want to do is build consensus, like, let's talk about the way that you're going about like making that invitation.
Yeah, well, in the third step, it's the art of invitation, right? So we're not quite there yet, like, because that's going to take other hosts in the core team for this circle of understanding to expand. And yeah, there's some context there with me and sort of whatever reputation I've established, like, you know, so certain people already will decline my invite automatically, right? And I'm aware of that. I'm totally self-aware, but I have so much faith in this process outside of me that it doesn't matter if they don't get it at first, because I think it will work for the people who do it. And
or it doesn't necessarily need to be you, right? It's like you do your part.
Yeah. I make all that clear in the article. Like, I have a particular role in all of this, but it's going to depend on other people, partners, and other callers, right? Other cohorts. Because at first, especially, it's, you know, it's just hard, you know, no matter who you are as an organizer, it's hard to get everybody to, you know, synchronize agendas and, you know, meet, you know, so that's new to me too, even to try to do that. So that's going to take some time, but.
Can I ask one more question? If you were to actually start small, like you said, and start with a one-on-one, and it was going to be you and someone else, I'm curious who you would do that with and what that would be.
Well, I've already started, right? It just depends on each person. Like, for example, I talked to Michelle Bowens a couple days ago, and I foregrounded it by saying that we like each other's work, but we disagree on some things. And some of that disagreement is generated through Facebook as opposed to talking face to face. Right. And in that session, I was kind of acting as the mediator and facilitator as well, even though that's not my training. Right. But I just took the initiative to say, hey, Michelle, this is how it's going to be, you know. And so, you know, we have a dialectic then. Right. So just in that one session, we generated some trust and we exchanged some information. Right. So it's far from the consensus building process, but we did touch on it. And we, you know, agreed that it went well, and we look forward to another session, right? So, you know, there's that, right? Like, it's already started, and it's going to be different with each person, right? And not every conversation has to be about consensus building, right? Like, you have to do lots of formative work, get to know each other. Sometimes it's just trading information, appreciating each other's work, right? So what I'm proposing as a kind of very systematic, like, invested, comprehensive process will take a lot of resources, right? Like, it's not even possible on a small scale necessarily, but we can do a lot on a small scale just with Zoom calls and just build up to it, right? So, you know, Lynn and I floated a number of topics that could be the content to put into a session, right? So, yeah.
Ryan, did you have, I mean, I know you watched all the Bowens sort of YouTube thing all the way through, and you were really impressed by it. What were your impressions?
Smart Hawk. Smart Hawk is, no, so yeah, I liked how you framed it, Brent, and I appreciated you very much on the call, and you were very patient too with Bowens because he kept on like interrupting you. But I guess my question, and this kind of gets back to the Dr. Strange thing, but I know that you two had some disagreements with like identity politics, or I mean, it even seemed like you had a lot of agreement, at least mutual understanding was there. So if you could generate some examples of what a consensus could have looked like if you came to one with Bowens, like what would be, I mean, we don't have to know specifically what it would be around the disagreement that you had, but what would be an example of what you could have come to in terms of a consensus?
Yeah, well, you know, there's an example here in my article about convergent conceptual change, right? And I like the phrasing of increasingly sophisticated approximations, right? That's one quote. So you have ongoing meetings and you build up an understanding through refinement of partial meanings and shared knowledge, right? Another quote from this paper is conversational turn-taking structures to negotiate meaning. So, I say to Bowens and I say to other people, like before I even publish this article, like it's going to take time. It's going to take many sessions back and forth, right? So if we haven't even started that process yet, then, you know, we're not getting any closer. And, you know, when it comes to something, ostensibly agree that it's this problem that's beyond us that is acting through us to perpetuate itself, right? And the only way to get out of it is kind of together. So to, you know, address the specific question about identity politics, like I tried to, you know, it's going to take time to unpack it with him, because ultimately he needs to get his version in his head that I can sign off on, and vice versa, right? Because as it stands, like the interesting thing about Bowens is he agrees with most of my intellectual dark web critique, but he's hung up on the identity politics thing. So, you know, with him or with anybody, if there's time and that's our focus, I would try to foreground some basic facts. For example, there's identity politics across the spectrum, right? So Black Lives Matter and white nationalism or white moderates are all identity politics. However, on the right, people deny that it's identity politics, right? Like Ben Shapiro hates identity politics. Tucker Carlson hates identity politics, but that's what they're doing. It's a kind of reverse identity politics, because they see all these Black people organizing and multicolored people, and they think, oh, it's threatening me, it's threatening the white establishment. So, you know, and there's better ways to frame that, but this is why we need facilitators. We need a mediator, kind of third parties. Like, so there's a kind of like on-call fact checker, somebody that all the participants trust, right? And we need recourse to shared resources, right? And that's what's great about people who read books. It's like, I share this with you, you share that with me, and then we can like speak that language, right? But what we see in the culture war is people totally talking past each other, totally getting, you know, totally just ensnared in their own echo chamber, you know, in the quicksand of whatever tribe that they're in. And so it's all self-defeating. You know, it's not that I'm self-defeating, it's that it's all self-defeating, because nobody's going to win that culture war. But the way I tried to frame it to Bowens is like, well, Black Lives Matter fundamentally is right. It's just a question of, you know, messaging and policy and, you know, how we come together around that. So I think he agreed on the basic principle that we're only going to get there through those conversations and ultimately through consensus building. For most people, it's a question of time. Like, who has the time to put into what I'm talking about? And I'm trying to say, well, you're all busy, but a lot of people are wasting time doing different things. And, you know, this is something we all have to check ourselves, you know, like, are we wasting time? Wasting time having fun? Wasting time doing the wrong research or going down rabbit holes? So.
Yeah, I think, you know, also when I hear consensus building, a big theme of this podcast has been about coherence. And I think an important piece of consensus building for our own mental health is having a coherent worldview and have it make sense. And justice obviously plays a huge role in that. So just to kind of pivot the subject a little bit, Ryan, did you want to kind of riff a little bit on maybe how this relates to the race issue that's going on in America right now from your point of view?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, this is a good segue, you know, talking about the culture wars and the polarization and how no one's going to win. And after the George Floyd murder, I saw a lot of polarization happening in my communities and with my friends and family and so forth. And a good chunk of people had a perspective that was unintuitive to me as a progressive, but this is what a lot of people were saying. This incident has nothing to do with race. It's just an incident of police brutality, or a police officer killed a citizen, one person killed another person. Don't project race into this and make this something that it's really not. The implications of that have been that therefore a lot of the talk about race, the kind of valorization of Black Lives Matter, and the kind of great awakening that's been taking place in a lot of, at least liberal sectors of the United States, is all misplaced and irrational. Because when you really look at the statistics, more white people get killed by the police, blah, blah, blah. I can go on and on about that kind of attitude. And I didn't really know how to respond or to engage with these people. I didn't even know where to start. And it was already so heated, you know, going on social media, on Twitter. I was like, I almost would like to settle a little bit, and then maybe we'll do some more like one-on-one, consensus building kind of stuff instead of like me jumping in there into this crazy Twitter storm. So this is open a question for all three of you, like, how have you been thinking about this in terms of race? And also to kind of piggyback off the balance conversation that Brent had, I mean, there's this feeling that a lot of people have that you can't even criticize Black Lives Matter or cancel culture or identity politics without getting canceled yourself, right? And so I'm just wondering, what do you guys think about that? Are these concerns overblown? Are they legitimate? How do we sense make with these things? I think my internet died.
Yeah, I mean, before I talk on that, I know, Stephanie, I know you have an integral vision for equality that you'd like to get out there, and a hypothesis. Do you feel okay talking about that right now? You're on mute.
That's a little separate from Ryan's question. So
You think so? Okay.
Stick with
Well,
Ryan.
for me, there's a lot of just to address Ryan. There's, and I don't have the facts right offhand, but I just see that as dismissing the history in the United States of America and where we are. And you can't ignore some of the context of that statement. And you're right. I'm not sure where I would want to start, and I'm not sure I would want to build a consensus with this person. I think you move into more of a debate, right? And then, that's a whole nother energy as far as trying to build a consensus with this person. And I just know, right, for this call here, I mean, I think consciously, I'm not so in that realm where I want to debate that person, because I believe I could do so with some practice and kind of getting into it. And do I really want to get into a boxing match right now? But I mean, so I don't have a direct answer to that person or to you, but I mean, that's just, to me, again, you lose to say that event was not racially motivated. And you look at all these different cases, and I just don't know if I would even go down that rabbit hole with that person. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and Ryan, you're asking like more generally too, right? Like, how do we unpack this? And I mean, definitely there needs to be a national conversation proper, right? Like truth and reconciliation and reparations, I think. But in terms of getting there, if so as Matt just said, like, it's, debate and, consensus building, deliberation, like they're different processes, different energies, and that's worth understanding. So, but if I was trying to build consensus, right, this is the thing that always comes back to me is, all across the political spectrum, there's people that make kind of fallacies in talking about it, right? Because race and racism are paradoxical. So before I unpack that, like Matt is correct, like there's a certain history that happened, right? There was white supremacy and slavery of Black people and genocide of Indigenous people. And so, those cultures were separate, very separate in the beginning. And now there's a lot of cultural overlap, right? And so that's why it becomes confusing for people. But that's just confusing. The reason it becomes paradoxical is because in the first instance, race and a lot of other social things are socially constructed, right? That means race doesn't empirically exist, right? But, we could say the same for gender, right? Even though clearly based on appearance, we have different races and genders in this call, right? But it's like, this is the paradox. Race is socially constructed, but it becomes reified and, made real over time. And it's paradoxical because people don't get the difference in between what's real and what is made real from the abstraction of it. Right, so the distinction of races, even though it's apparent in skin color, especially how we're geographically separated in early human evolution, it's still, environmentally and socially determined and constructed. And then when it comes to, globalization and how we all intermix and how we talk about this stuff conceptually, it becomes reified, and so what I mean by that is that, like, it, you know, if we're smart about it, we can actually decouple the skin color from the race, from the appearance of race, right? So I can take on a kind of Black feminist approach to things, right? If that's the literature I'm immersed in, and that's the perspective I'm identifying with, then that's what I can advocate for. You know, I'm not advocating for white male issues. But again, coming back to this social construction thing, like, see, this in itself, in a consensus building context, would take a while to unpack and to build up, because social construction it's not apparent what that means, right? It's a term from sociology, and it gets distorted through postmodernism and the reaction to postmodernism, right? But I think people can get it. I think people can grok it if it's kind of deployed in the right environment, in a kind of the space is held for that. So I'll stop there. That's where I would start. How does that land with you guys?
Yeah, Brent, I mean, kind of what you're saying with that whole Stuart Sensei's part. And two, I'm reading this book called Subtle Activism, and they talk about more traditional societies, the elders, I really like this phrase, and you kind of just hit on it, of holding the space. And Ryan, I know you've talked in the past about this. This is, to me, a lot of what mimetic mediation does, is you're able to hold both perspectives and kind of find out what energy is kind of going on there. Another thing I wanted to bring up too, that kind of maybe better addresses your question, Ryan, because the whole book I thought really spoke to it, was Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers. I'd really highly recommend anyone that's interested in police reform to read that book and to find out kind of the issues that he brings up in that book. But Ryan, you must obviously have a position with that question, and I'm kind of curious what your take on it is.
Sure. I was wondering if Stephanie had thoughts first, though. I disconnected a few times.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, the first thought that comes up is just this. I mean, what we're seeing is just really hard to look at, you know? So it doesn't surprise me that we're reacting to it, you know, in all kinds of ways, but including defensively for some people, like, oh, this isn't about race, you know, especially from white people, whether consciously or subconsciously. It's like, you know, I'm on the side of the oppressor just by virtue of my own skin color, and therefore, you know, so I mean, this is hard. This is like a collective seeing clearly of something really horrific, and like really having to grieve it and mourn it, and like, you know, like getting defensive about it and working through that. I also just, yeah, it's just like, it's just this, it's like, it's both true that some people are saying, oh, this isn't about race, and you know, we're also going overboard with using race. It's like, yeah. And I guess I just also want to, like, maybe kind of within the context of individual people and individual conversations, it might not feel that productive, but like, may the collective tug of war in and of itself be productive, in the sense of like, evolution is beautiful, but it's not pretty. Yeah, I'm just kind of riffing along. I guess, yeah, on the point of like,
I was just going to ask, if George Floyd was white, do we think that would have happened as a group?
Would he have gotten killed, or would we have had such
that he would have been on the guy's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds? If George Floyd was white, do we think that would have happened?
It's possible. I think this is the thing with this sort of incident / murder, is that these things happen all the time and we just don't see it, right? So we're seeing maybe 1% or 0.1%, right? It's all about what goes viral. And, you know, the Ahmaud Arbery shooting happened in February, but we didn't see the video until like April, right? So there's a lot going on here. Like these things are always happening, right? And, you know, like white people do get killed by police, you know, like so it's both racial and non-racial, right? Like, and that's why intersectionality is actually so important, because it's not just a way to measure victimhood. No, it's a way for everybody whoever they are, wherever they are in the world, to understand the intersection of these identity factors and class factors, and, you know, and to the extent that those are socially constructed and made real. So I think we're only going to have an actual, you know, paradigm shift if at least that kind of like level of resolution is brought to the public conversation through the mass media and through think tanks and through university, you know, because there is a lot of bad, like just to kind of hit on a point I kind of missed before that I wanted to say, like, there's Black people and there's white people who will reify it. And I just did it there in that phrase, right? If you speak like that, it accidentally reifies the category, right? But then there's also context in which that race plays no role or function, or we can ignore it. Like, for example, you know, we know sports like football and basketball are predominantly African-American people, but nobody says that that's racist against white people. And it's not, obviously. But one could conceivably look at the picture and think that, oh, short people and white people are discriminated against, right? But, you know, and it's not my place to say, I'm not in the world of sports, but it also goes the other way, right? There's arguments that say that those sports themselves with predominantly African-American players are also racist because they're owned by white people, right? So you have all the coaches and the owners of these teams being white people. And so that's a complicated juxtaposition too, right? Doesn't mean the individual white people are racist, but it speaks to the more complex side of this problem that we're trying to get at, which is the system, the systemic aspect of racism and economic inequality and like knowledge inequality, you know, educational access and information quality. So, you know, coming back to the meta crisis, right? Like we can stay at this level of systemic racism, but that's a subset of the bigger picture too.
Yeah, I mean, something that's kind of lost it, but there, to me, just, Brent, this also, just to clarify with the diagram you shared on the convergence for consensus building, is what we're doing now the sort of harvest part? I mean, are we kind of sense making this right now in this discussion, would you say? Yeah. Okay. So
yeah, I mean, we're not doing the process explicitly, but we could say that we're kind of going through it implicitly, yeah. Sure, and that we're approaching that stage of this. Yeah.
And I think a key piece to this, and I know Stephanie, you obviously hit on a lot of this stuff, at least with the Reckoning shows that I've listened to, and Ryan and I think for the Growing Down, we've definitely tried to go, and probably not explicitly enough, to talk about justice and really what that justice piece means. But, you know, just kind of hearing all these different ideas together, hitting on Brent's thing he brought up with the paradixity and the depersonalization, emotional economy, and the core area of development there is the ability to genuinely care for others. And I think when you look at an event like George Floyd, you think an injustice was done, correct? So is it worth arguing about sort of the race problem? I mean, talk about the justice problem side of it. I mean, if we're talking about public safety, there's no fucking public safety when the cop is got on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That's a clear out murder. So yeah. It's going to be up to the judge to debate whether or not that was racially motivated, whether it's bad police culture, whatever you call it. At the end of the day, it's not justice. And so something wrong happened there, and people are pissed off. And you can go all to these different areas about what led to this injustice. But I think that, to me, that's the key point. Like, if you think a police officer has the right to do that, I'm not even having a real good conversation with you, because it's probably not going to go well.
Yeah, I mean, my take, my primary lens of looking at these things is as a mediator who's practically trying to solve problems, is that, like, for example, I listened to Sam Harris's thing on the take on all of the craziness that's transpired since George Floyd's death, and where I think he made some good points, and he tried to factually contextualize the whole event. Let me tell you where I hard disagree with him, is that he I don't know if it's because he's a white person or because he's ideologically very anti-woke and anti-SJW, but he still doesn't really seem to empathize or really understand the symbolic universe and lived experiences of Black people, and how traumatizing and infuriating that event of a white police officer kneeling on this guy's neck for 8 minutes and 40 seconds, like that land, if you're a Black person, right, that will land with you completely differently than with any other ethnicity, especially when the thought goes through your head, that could have been me, that could have been my mom, that could have been my brother, right? And it's understanding the lived experiences of certain groups that were racialized and having empathy for, and being able to take those perspectives, I think is such an important skill that the social justice movement tries to promote. They may not promote it in the best way, but still something that they try to promote. And I don't feel like, I think we need to have a more productive conversation around that. And just to give an example, if I'm mediating between two neighbors, one is white and one is Black, and the incident that they're arguing over has nothing to do about race. In my experience, whenever there are two different racial groups or ethnicities involved in a conflict, and the conflict is fairly heated, race almost always becomes a factor, even though the issue was like, your apple tree grew into my yard. As a mediator, am I going to tell one of the parties, dude, this has nothing to do about race? No, that's not a productive way to handle it. If race comes up and it's an important issue to the participants, we're going to address the racial issue and then go deeper into the issue that started the conflict to begin with, whether that was racially inspired or not. So I don't agree with a lot of people who say we just need to cancel the race discussion. We need to explore the real pain and trauma and wounding and anger that the Black community justifiably feels because of the entire freaking history. And then we need to come to deeper solutions and universal solutions, whether it's police reform or even things like UBI, universal healthcare, that disproportionately help people of color and historically marginalized groups. And then we can talk about more specific ways of ameliorating inequalities, whether it be what Stephanie wanted to talk about with going into specific programs to try to promote more equality, gender equality, or racial equality, and so forth, right? But I think that we need to have a better discussion about taking the perspectives of other people and understanding that experience and working with the pain and the emotions that are rising, and not just being like, you're irrational, learn the facts there and not be upset, which is kind of what Sam Harris was promoting. And factually speaking, that does not work in solving a conflict. So that's kind of where I come down really hard as a mediator of like, if race is an issue, we need to talk about race.
I feel like there's totally an analogy there with Me Too, and like these things would come up. It's like, but is it really sexual harassment? It's like, wait a sec, this person felt like shit after your interaction with them. Do you care about that or do you not? I mean, because it's like, at the end of the day, right? It's like, do we care about how we're affecting other people or do we not? And then, right, we can carve out all kinds of legal definitions for all kinds of things. But yeah, the question of like actually caring how we're affecting other people is like, what should ideally be underneath, and at the foundation of all of this. So.
I mean, the other, again, talking about holding space, I'm also totally against the group out there that, they're saying all cops are bastards. I mean, to me, that just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, to take one event and say, therefore, this conclusion, come on, man. I mean, that's totally extreme. It's totally reactionary. And I don't want to just go to the other side, right? Just swing one way or the other. To me, it's about justice. And the definition I use at work is, this is also the restorative justice thing, is to right your wrongs, to find out where the wrong was and to right it, and to not overcomplicate it, and to just try to find, how do you make it right? And that's sort of going back to the religious perspective of it, spiritual perspective of try to find out where the wrong is and how as a community can you right that? And I think that's the important conversation. And to be careful of joining sort of extreme thinking, reactionary thinking. And so I think the holding space piece is important, to kind of take maybe conflicting views and not, kind of try to navigate both of those different energies and see what happens.
I will say, however, though, for like from one extreme to the other, in with many of the people that I've interviewed, it took like one or two of them for them to be like, wait a second, I'm swinging from one extreme to the other. Perhaps there's more than, like one direction, opposite direction. Perhaps there's actually 360 degrees in this circle. Perhaps this circle is actually a sphere, so perhaps there's more than 3 dimensions. So sometimes it's like swing and back to realize that that's what you're doing, to then kind of see that there's many more dimensions to go in. So I guess that, and that kind of goes back to the may this tug of war be productive. May our seeing our own tugging of war and going back and forth help us. I said this when we spoke last Saturday, to me, it's it's no accident. If we're going to take spiral dynamics on face value for a second, it's no accident that second tier comes after green, which is we're doing all this tugging of warring, but may we actually see that we're doing that, and that it's not that there's a new direction to be gone in. So.
That was a beautiful visual you gave us with the circle and then the sphere, because I think that's totally true. And also the tug of war, I've always liked that metaphor, because it's 2 sides that are willfully participating in a game, right? And they could just and the idea is to drag one of the other sides into the mud, right? But if, you could just put the rope down and go have lunch. but along the lines of what you were saying, I wanted to say about ACAB, I think there's a place for all of this, right? We have to be really careful. If Black people want to say ACAB, or even white people, right? Or just, people, right? These are abstractions. But I think there's a place for it all, right? So the ACAB kind of hashtag gets you into a different conversation, gets you into a different, sphere of research. And there's an article that was passed around that was like I was a former bastard cop or something. And there's the personal perspective that validates it, but there's lots of other evidence that, frames, especially in America, right? It's different in different places, but America especially, they're all trained to be bastards in a sense. And, perhaps I would just try to scale it back and say, maybe we should say MCAB, most cops are bastards. But at any rate, the framing can be effective or misleading to different people. What we have to do is get that pendulum going around the whole sphere, and shift building consensus, shifting the discussion to what it's actually about. And so I'm nodding along with all of you guys too, as you say what you're saying, because you're adding different critiques and different upregulation. So I feel like we're implicitly doing that. We're practicing it now.
Yeah, and I think Stephanie kind of brings up a good point with, at least for the lens that I use, I do bring in a developmental theorist kind of spiral dynamics kind of look on it. And, there's a lot of those different memes that are kind of conflicting with each other. And hopefully, whether it be metamodern, whether it be emerge, whether it be game B, whether it be integral, whatever it is, if there's another sort of tier above that's able to sort of mediate between these memes, that's able to kind of allow a space to happen where there's a conversation. So ultimately, I think people would say there's a lot of conflict right now. There's a lot of injustice right now on so many different fronts that it's very overwhelming. And I think what I see happening with these different communities out there are trying to dive right into the center and trying to identify, okay, well, what is it we have to keep going back to over and over again that can make sense of this situation to provide solutions? Because I think in general, humans don't do well with the uncertainty. I think they like, solutions to problems that are out there. I think we tend to want justice when there's injustice going around. So again, going back sort of with Brent's piece, I think we're really trying to, try to find a community that is able to maybe see things and hold all these different complexities with and make sense of it. And so I know for me, why I joined the Discord group and the intergroup and sought them out was for that community piece of it. Because I can think, oh, well, in my head, I'm totally right. Well, as soon as I get with 3 of you guys and you come from all different perspectives and your past and your beliefs, all of a sudden, like my way of thinking my ego has to be exploded a little bit. And I have to really go into that realm and be able to balance that out. And it's not easy. And I think, you know, if you look historically over time with humans and where we are right now, I think we are left with not really having the answers for most, you know, most people would say that. And I think it's important that we are having these conversations to try to make sense, because I think it's so important for our well-being and our mental health that we belong to communities that are seeing, like, does this satisfy my needs for the good, right? Of the good, the beautiful, and the true. And I think that's what's important, being around you guys, able to have these conversations. And the more information we can bring in and collaborate, I think overall, the better we will be.
Yeah, well said. Well
Amen.
said. We have about 9 minutes left. I was wondering if you wanted to tackle one more subject. And I have Stephanie's list up here about an integral left point of view on gender/racial equality. What's an integral vision for equality, and how do we get there? And we have a hypothesis about this. Let's
Well,
hear
I
it.
guess, all right. Yeah, I mean, I guess just, you know, when I think about, let's say, gender equality, you know, I envision something dynamic. I envision something emergent. I don't envision something that's like, okay, now it's your turn and now it's your turn. And it's like this like flat equal thing. I envision something that's very alive, and it's like whoever has what needs to be said gets the mic. And it's a dynamic equilibrium. And my sense is, and perhaps this is painfully obvious, but because of historic inequities, we may need to actually start at a very flat place where it's like, now it's your turn and now it's your turn, or you haven't had a lot of turns in a long time, so you're just going to get, you know, all the turns for a second. There's a, you know, which means, you know, affirmative action and other equalizing policies might feel really contrived right now as we compensate for centuries of racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. But as those policies kind of do their work, we can move towards something that is more emergent, or like a rightful expression of all, you know, races, genders, etc. There's a tech university in Denmark that I just read an article in The Guardian the other day that, so they realized that if they just kept they have their, like, you know, their gender policy of like trying to hire more women, and they realized that if they just kept going with that policy, they wouldn't have like a gender balance until 2042. And they're like, you know what, we don't want to wait that long. So they have pledged to only hire women across all academic positions at all levels until they reach a target of 30% women professors in every department. Like, new vacancies will be closed to men for the first 6 months, and then departments will open up the recruitment pool, you know, provided that they can demonstrate that no qualified women were available. And obviously this policy is getting a lot of heat, and it's like, it's kind of like critiquing this like flat, you know, it's like, aren't we going overboard? This isn't what equality should look like. But yeah, I guess the idea here is and I think a way to frame these kinds of policies is as a necessary, even if artificial, like, stepping stone from, you know, where we are now to the like ultimate kind of like more dynamic equilibrium that we want to move towards.
I mean, my thoughts right off the bat there, and again, it's a whole nother conversation, but something that popped in my head is the unintended consequences of that. And maybe there's nothing, but I mean, a lot of times people can have good intentions and maybe people aren't really thinking of the consequences. I'm not saying specifically on that sort of example you brought up, because I don't know enough about it, but I know that, you know, in theory, it sounds perfect, but then, you know, who else is marginalized in that process? And is it, and how, if we're concerned with equality and, you know, also with meritocracy, again, there's a lot of different, again, sides, views, spaces to hold with some like proposals. And so I think the important piece with that is to have kind of conversations around it and find out kind of what comes up.
I'm sorry, just what I guess but the question here is like, what is the goal, right? Like,
What
where
is
are
the
we
goal?
trying to go? You know, and if the goal is to have, I mean, let's just say in this context, like a greater gender balance of genders within this tech university. What I'm saying is like the path there might not, the evolution is beautiful, but it's not pretty. The path there may not be very pretty. It may feel unfair. It may feel flat. It may feel not like the kind of, you know, the like ideal vision of equality that we have. But like, you know, that's like, it's like this, and I guess I would say, and I don't even, yeah, I guess I would say that should be part of how these policies are framed and introduced, as like, maybe you don't like this, like what this looks like, but like, let's, you know, what we're trying to do is make the case that it's a necessary step towards where we want to go. That looks like this, which is maybe a vision that you can get on board with.
So to go back to your
Brent, it
question,
looks like you have something you
is
wanna
the
say.
goal 50-50?
No,
What's the goal?
no, and actually I would even say like the goal is even, the thing is we don't even know. That's like the amazing thing is like, let us just surprise ourselves. I think the goal is again, it's like, who has what needs to be said gets the mic. That sounds ridiculous, maybe, but the goal is something that's more alive. The goal is like swarm intelligence. The goal is like a flock of birds, and whoever has what the flock needs, you know? So like, who knows what that's gonna look like? And maybe at that point, we won't even be talking as much about male-bodied and women-bodied. We'll be talking about male energy and female energy, you know? But like, at least let's give ourselves like a fighting chance to like have that, the rightful expression of like whatever needs to be expressed emerge. Let's give ourselves the fighting chance by like doing this contrived artificial thing, if that makes sense.
So you're in support of that policy?
I think if I wasn't looking at it through an integral lens, no, I would probably not. But it looks different to me. It looks like when I think of it as a stepping stone, when I think of it as a means, I may be in support of it. Brent, it looks like you're.
Yeah, this is a super complicated kind of like issue to end with. But I like what you said there with about swarm intelligence and stuff, because it wasn't a dodge. It was actually a clever way to tackle the problem head on, because because you do want, you know, people to have the freedom to pursue the careers that they want. And so I want to say that like quotas don't always work, but also, you know, just really quickly, what underpins these things is kind of the economic relations. So if you do have to displace men from, you know, a university department for whatever, like, make sure they have a fallback position too, right? Everybody should have access to whatever kind of work that they want, especially as automation comes more online and we pursue more ambitious things like UBI, right? So these are going to take care of everybody in a different way. And there'll be more, you know, community and volunteer type activity and work that can displace the formal modes of work that we're talking about. There's also the question of like, you know, just sticking women in fix the problem if those women behave and think like the worst men. You know, so there's a kind of abstract feminism that underpins this. And so that's all I can add to that. But I wanted to close with something that's really on point, not in a good way, because it complicates this whole situation. But this exact kind of case, I'm not sure the case you're referring to, but this exact kind of case came up recently with a specific incident, and Jordan Peterson blogged about it like 4 days ago. So this guy is coming back, and he's coming back exactly the same, right? And it was about this kind of thing, like it was about chemistry, actually chemists being kind of displaced because they didn't, you know, properly kind of honor the equity and diversity and inclusion kind of tenets, right? So there was that, and it's kind of a catastrophe, because the hard sciences are a bit more objective, but the complaint of like colonialism in the sciences is also quite nuanced, right? So that's it's difficult to unpack, and then there's miscommunication between the two sides. And then essentially Jordan Peterson's article was overreacting to this whole thing in defense of the status quo, right? In defense of the white man chemist who lost his position. And it was interesting, and it's, it's, throwing a bomb into a hornet's nest here because his article invoked George Floyd and that event and the protests and stuff, but only very briefly, and only to say that these, sort of social justice warriors are actually exploiting that kind of cultural climate now to advance more of their aggressive demands for equality, right? So there's a little bit of truth in what he's complaining about, but there's also no kind of sense of proportion and context with history and with the big picture. So as I say, this is kind of the first hints of him planning his return to the public sphere. So Bernie's already out of the picture somewhat. So the culture war is coming back, ladies and gentlemen. And I think we need to build consensus through it. I don't want to relive the same bullshit.
Well, what a wonderful place to end. Couldn't think of a better. Yeah, thank you
Here's
everyone.
not reliving the same bullshit.
Yeah, and the culture war and the return of Jordan Peterson. It's like the return of the Sith or something. But yeah, thanks everyone. This has been really fun, and obviously we've unpacked a lot here, but there's always a lot more to dive into and a lot more rabbit holes to go down in future conversations. So yeah, this has been great. Let's do this again. And Matt, do you have final words?
No, good talk. I enjoyed it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for inviting us, y'all.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep. Have a good day, guys.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. Oh, shit.
Okay, I remember you guys actually do